the voice that drifted through the saloon doors that September evening in 1878 could make a man forget his own name. And Frank Garrison nearly did when he heard it for the first time in Central City, Colorado. He had ridden 3 days straight from Wyoming, his bones aching and his throat parched, seeking nothing more than whiskey and a bed. But the moment that melody reached his ears, everything else became secondary. The woman stood in the corner of the Lucky Dollar Saloon, her dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders, her eyes closed as she sang a ballad about lost love and distant homes. At her feet sat a battered tin cup with maybe a dozen pennies scattered inside, gleaming dull copper in the lamplight. Frank had never considered himself a romantic man. At 27, he had spent the better part of his adult life driving cattle, breaking horses, and keeping his head down through more than a few range wars. Romance seemed like something for men who did not have dirt under their fingernails and scars across their knuckles. But when Beatrice Ellis opened her eyes at the end of her song and looked directly at him, something fundamental shifted in his chest. The sparse crowd in the saloon offered scattered applause, a few men tossing additional pennies into her cup without much enthusiasm. They had heard her before, clearly, and familiarity had bred indifference. Frank watched as she bent to collect the coins, counting them carefully before slipping them into a small cloth purse tied at her waist. Her dress was simple, made of faded calico that had been mended more than once, but she carried herself with a dignity that no amount of poverty could diminish. He found himself walking toward her before his mind caught up with his feet. The gold coins in his pocket felt heavy suddenly, weighted with purpose. He had just sold a herd for a rancher down south, and his cut was substantial, more money than he usually carried at once. Frank pulled out 3 gold eagles and dropped them into her cup with a metallic clink that turned heads throughout the saloon. Beatrice looked down at the coins, then up at him, her brown eyes wide with shock. "Sir, I think you have made a mistake." "No mistake." His voice came out rougher than he intended, unused to speaking much after days alone on the trail. "I would like to make a request." "I sing what I know, and I know perhaps 20 songs," she said carefully, her fingers hovering near the gold but not touching it, as though afraid it might vanish or burn her. "Then sing all 20. Sing them twice if you have a mind to. I will sit right here and listen until you are done." A flush crept up her neck, coloring her cheeks. "That is too much money for simple songs." "That depends on the songs and who is singing them." The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who had seen everything twice, called out from behind the bar. "Miss Ellis, you had best take the man's money and sing. We do not get many gentlemen cowboys in here willing to pay in gold." Frank pulled out a chair from the nearest table and sat, his eyes never leaving her face. Beatrice stood frozen for another moment, then slowly bent to retrieve the coins. She held them in her palm, studying them as though they might reveal some secret, before finally securing them in her purse alongside the pennies. "What would you like to hear first?" she asked quietly. "Whatever moves you." She sang a song about the ocean then, though Frank suspected she had never seen it. Her voice transformed the cramped, smoke-filled saloon into something larger, something that smelled of salt and endless horizons. Men stopped their card games to listen. The bartender paused mid-pour. Even the piano player, who usually pounded away regardless of what else was happening, let his hands fall still on the keys. Frank learned more about Beatrice Ellis in the hours that followed than he had learned about most people in years. Not from conversation, but from the way she chose her songs, the emotions that flickered across her face, the subtle changes in her voice. She sang about loneliness and hope, about leaving and staying, about love found and love lost. Each song felt like a page from a diary she was allowing him to read. When she finally stopped, her voice growing hoarse, the saloon had mostly emptied. Only a few dedicated drinkers remained, slumped at their tables. Frank had not moved from his chair, had barely blinked. "I should go," Beatrice said. "It is late. Let me walk you home." "That is not necessary." "I insist." She studied him for a long moment, and Frank tried to imagine what she saw. He had not looked in a mirror in days, but he knew he must appear rough, trail-worn, possibly dangerous. Most respectable women would refuse such an offer from a stranger, but Beatrice simply nodded. "I live at the boarding house on 3rd Street, she said. They walked through the dark streets of Central City, the mountain air crisp and cold at this altitude. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light at irregular intervals. Somewhere a dog barked, and further away, the stamp mills that processed ore from the mines kept up their endless rhythm. "You are not from here originally," Frank said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Neither are you." "Wyoming, mostly. Before that, Missouri, Boston," she said. "Before that, England, though I barely remember it. I came here 6 months ago." "Why Central City?" She was quiet for several steps. "I followed someone. He worked in the mines. He said we would be married once he struck it rich." Her laugh was bitter. "He died in a cave-in 3 months ago. Turns out he was already married anyway, had a wife back in Pennsylvania. I am sorry." "Do not be. I learned a valuable lesson about trust and about men who make promises." They reached the boarding house, a narrow 2-story building that had seen better days. Beatrice paused on the bottom step, turning to face him. "Thank you for the escort and for your generosity tonight. That money will help considerably. Sing for me again tomorrow." "I sing at the Lucky Dollar every night. Then I will be there tomorrow night. You will grow tired of the same 20 songs." "I doubt that very much." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes, and Frank felt that shift in his chest again, stronger this time. "What is your name?" she asked. "Frank Garrison." "Beatrice Ellis, though I suppose you heard Pete use my name. It suits you." "Good night, Frank Garrison." "Good night, Beatrice Ellis." He watched until she disappeared inside, then walked back toward the livery stable where he had left his horse and gear. The stable hand had told him about a clean hotel nearby, but Frank found his thoughts too turbulent for sleep. Instead, he checked on his horse, a reliable sorrel gelding named Red, and then wandered the streets until dawn began to break over the mountains. Central City perched precariously on the steep slopes of the Rockies, built in a rush after gold was discovered nearby 20 years earlier. The initial boom had faded, but the town still thrived on hard rock mining, silver and gold pulled from deep shafts driven into the mountain. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost, where people came seeking something better and often found only back-breaking labor and disappointment. Frank knew he should move on. He had no business in Central City, no job waiting, no reason to stay. But when evening came, he found himself walking back to the Lucky Dollar saloon, his pockets still heavy with gold. Beatrice was already there, standing in her usual corner. Tonight she wore a different dress, still simple but in better condition, a deep blue that brought out the warmth in her eyes. When she saw him enter, something like relief crossed her face, so quick he almost missed it. He took the same table as before and waited. She sang the same songs, but they sounded different tonight, more intimate somehow, as though she were singing only for him. When she finished the first one, Frank added another gold coin to her cup. By the third song, other men in the saloon began to take notice, started paying attention to what they had been ignoring. By the fifth song, the place was quieter than Frank had ever heard a saloon get. This became their pattern. Every night for a week, Frank came to the Lucky Dollar, sat at the same table, and listened to Beatrice sing. Every night he paid her in gold, far more than her songs would fetch otherwise, though he privately thought no amount could truly capture their worth. They spoke little during these performances, but afterward, he would walk her home, and in those dark streets, they began to truly talk. He learned that she was 24, that her mother had died when she was young, that her father had been a clerk who spent more than he earned and left her with nothing but debts when he passed. She had worked as a seamstress, a lady's companion, and briefly as a teacher before circumstances led her west. She had been singing since childhood in church choirs and later in more desperate venues, wherever anyone would listen and pay. She learned that Frank had left home at 16 after his father's farm failed, that he had worked as a drover, a ranch hand, a temporary lawman in one very temporary town. He told her about the vast openness of Wyoming, the way herds of cattle could stretch to the horizon, the particular quality of silence that existed in wild places. He did not tell her about the violent things he had done, the men he had faced down, the times he had come close to dying. Those stories seemed to belong to a different person. On the 8th night, as they walked toward her boarding house, Beatrice stopped suddenly in the middle of the street. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Walking you home. All of it. The gold every night. You could have any woman in Central City with the money you have been spending. Prettier women, younger women. I do not want any other woman in Central City. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you work harder than anyone I have met. I know you have been hurt, but you have not let it make you bitter. I know that when you sing, something inside me that I did not know was broken starts to feel whole again." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "Pretty words from a cowboy. Not pretty, true. What do you want from me, Frank?" "I want you to sing forever, but not for pennies and not in that saloon." "What does that mean?" He took a breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff with no idea how far the fall might be. "Come with me. Let me take care of you. Let me give you a home, a real home, where you never have to count pennies again. You are asking me to be your kept woman. I am asking you to be my wife." The words hung in the air between them, solid and real. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. "You cannot be serious. We have known each other barely over a week. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. This is insane. Probably. People do not do this. Some people do, people who know what they want when they see it." She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "I do not even know if you snore, or if you are cruel when you drink, or if you have debts or enemies or a dozen children scattered across the territories. I do snore sometimes. I do not drink often, and I am told I get quiet and sad when I do, not cruel. I owe no man anything. I have enemies, probably, but none that I know of currently, and I have no children anywhere that I am aware of. This is not how things are done." "How are things done, Beatrice? You sang for pennies because a man made you promises he never meant to keep. You trusted the proper way of doing things, and where did that leave you? Sometimes the improper way is the only honest one." She was quiet for a long time, looking down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean closer to hear. "I am afraid. So am I. What if we are making a terrible mistake? Then we will make it together." She looked up at him then, and in the lamplight he saw tears on her cheeks. "I barely know you, and I should say no, and this is probably the most foolish thing I have ever considered, but yes. Yes, Frank Garrison, I will marry you." He kissed her then, there in the middle of the street, and it felt like the first truly right thing he had done in his entire life. They were married 3 days later by a Methodist minister who asked few questions after Frank pressed extra money into his hand. Beatrice wore a new dress, pale yellow with lace at the collar and cuffs, bought from the best shop in Central City. Frank wore new clothes too, traded his trail-worn gear for a proper suit that made him feel like he was playing dress-up. But the look on Beatrice's face when she saw him made the discomfort worthwhile. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Murphy, stood as witness along with Pete from the saloon, who cleaned up surprisingly well. After the brief ceremony, they ate dinner at the best restaurant in town, a place Frank would have never entered on his own, where the silverware was real silver and the napkins were cloth. "Where will we go?" Beatrice asked as they ate. "I have been thinking about that. I have money saved enough to buy land. Maybe not here, too expensive and too crowded, but south down near Colorado Springs or even further, somewhere we can build something real. You would give up the cowboy life, the trail driving. That life is for young men with nothing to lose. I am ready for something different, a ranch, maybe, or just a small place with some horses, some cattle, enough to live on. You could sing whenever you wanted, for whoever you wanted, or for no one but me. Your choice." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I spent so long trying to find security, chasing after it, thinking someone else would provide it. Maybe I need to build it myself with you." They spent their wedding night at the hotel, the nicest room available. And Frank was gentle with her, patient, understanding that for all her bravery she was frightened. They lay awake afterward, talking in whispers, learning the geography of each other's bodies and histories, filling in the gaps that remained. "Tell me about your family," she said, her head resting on his chest. "Not much to tell. My father was a dreamer who was not very good at making dreams real. He bought land in Missouri, tried farming, failed, tried again in Kansas, failed worse. By the time I was old enough to help, there was nothing left to save. My mother died of fever when I was 14. My father followed her 2 years later, just gave up, I think. I had a sister younger. She married a shopkeeper in St. Louis. We exchange letters sometimes, not often. Do you miss them? My mother, yes. My sister sometimes. My father, I do not know. I spent so much time being angry at him for failing us that I forgot to know him otherwise. Would you want children? Someday. With you, yes. With anyone else, I never thought about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I always wanted a large family. 5 or 6 children, a house full of noise and life. But I am old enough now to know that wanting something does not make it possible. 24 is not old. Old enough to know the world does not bend to wishes. Maybe our world will be different." They left Central City a week later, heading south as the autumn colors began to paint the mountains. Frank had sold his services as a guide to a family moving to Colorado Springs, which provided extra money and a purpose for the journey. Beatrice rode beside him on a gentle mare he had bought for her few possessions packed on a mule along with his gear. The family they guided, the Thorntons, had 3 children and were full of hope about starting fresh in a new place. Frank found himself envying their innocent optimism, even as he worked to ensure they reached their destination safely. Beatrice helped Mrs. Thornton with the children and the cooking, and Frank saw how naturally she fit into that role, how the children gravitated toward her, especially in the evenings when she would sing them to sleep. They reached Colorado Springs in late October, delivered the Thorntons to their destination, and then continued further south, scouting for land. Frank wanted something specific, though he could not quite articulate what until he saw it. The property sat in a valley with mountains visible to the west, a creek running through it, enough flat land for crops or grazing, enough shelter for building. An old prospector owned it or claimed to, and was willing to sell cheap because he had given up on finding gold there. Frank suspected the title might be questionable, but after investigation in the nearest town, he determined it was legitimate enough for their purposes. They bought it with most of Frank's savings, and immediately began the work of building a life. Those first months were the hardest Frank had ever worked, and he had worked hard all his life. They lived in a tent while he built a cabin, racing against winter. Beatrice helped where she could, hauling water, preparing food, holding boards steady while he nailed them in place. Her hands, which had been soft when they met, developed calluses. His back, which had ached before, now screamed in constant protest. But every evening, no matter how exhausted they were, Beatrice would sing. Sometimes while they worked, sometimes after, sometimes in the middle of the night when the cold woke them. Her voice became the soundtrack to their new life, a constant reminder of why they were doing this. The cabin was finished by the first snowfall, crude but solid, one room with a loft, a stone fireplace that Frank built with more hope than skill. It leaked smoke sometimes, and the wind found gaps in the chinking, but it was theirs, truly theirs, in a way nothing had ever been before for either of them. Winter that year was harsh, isolating them for weeks at a time. They lived on supplies they had stockpiled and game Frank hunted when the weather permitted. Some days they barely spoke, the work of survival taking all their energy. Other days they talked for hours, sharing stories, dreams, fears. Beatrice told him about her mother, a singer in small theaters in England before marriage and immigration silenced her voice. She told him about the shame of poverty, of working in houses where she was treated as less than human, of the desperation that had driven her to follow a lying man west. Frank told her about watching his family's dreams die slowly, about the violence of the cattle drives, about men he had known who were killed by weather, by animals, by other men. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, of going days without meaningful conversation, of forgetting sometimes what his own voice sounded like. "You regret it?" she asked one night as they lay beneath every blanket they owned, the fire burning low. "This life, me, all of it?" "Never." "Not once. I regret that I did not meet you sooner. I regret the years I wasted. But this us here?" "Never." Spring came eventually, as it always does, melting the snow and revealing the land they now owned. Frank planted crops, working from memory and limited experience. Beatrice started a garden near the cabin. They bought chickens from a neighbor 10 miles away, then a pig, then 2 goats. The work was constant, from before dawn to after dusk, but it was different from the work they had done before. This work built something that would last, something that belonged to them. Every fence post Frank sank into the ground was a statement of permanence. Every seed Beatrice planted was an act of faith in the future. In June, she told him she was pregnant. They were in the garden when she said it, Frank repairing a fence nearby. She just stopped working suddenly and announced it, her voice matter of fact, but her hands were shaking. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor, which would require riding 2 hours to town." He dropped his tools and went to her, pulling her into his arms. "How do you feel?" "Terrified, excited, sick in the mornings, happy. We should go to town, see a doctor, make sure everything is all right. We cannot afford to waste a day traveling when there is so much work to do, Beatrice." "Next week. I promise. Right now, I just want to sit here with you and think about the fact that we are going to be parents." They sat together in the dirt of their garden, surrounded by young plants pushing up toward the sun, and talked about names and futures and all the things they hoped for their child. The doctor in town confirmed what they already knew and declared Beatrice healthy, the baby developing normally. He gave them advice that mostly consisted of common sense and charged them $3. They bought supplies, including fabric for baby clothes, and headed home. Summer passed in a rhythm of work and planning. The crops grew, the animals thrived, Beatrice's belly swelled. Frank found himself talking to the baby sometimes when he thought no one could hear, telling it about the land, about the creek, about its mother's beautiful voice. In August, they had their first real visitors. A couple from a neighboring property, the Crawfords, rode over to introduce themselves. They had heard someone had bought the old prospector's land and wanted to meet the newcomers. They were older, in their 50s, with grown children back east. Mrs. Crawford took one look at Beatrice and immediately began offering advice and assistance. "You will need help when your time comes," she said firmly. "I have birthed 5 babies of my own and helped with a dozen others. You send your husband for me the moment things start, you hear." The Crawfords became regular visitors after that, stopping by every few weeks. They brought food, tools, information about the area. More importantly, they brought companionship, relief from the isolation. Beatrice and Mrs. Crawford, whose first name was Helen, became especially close, trading recipes and stories during long afternoons. Through the Crawfords, Frank and Beatrice met other neighbors, scattered though they were across the vast landscape. There was the Patterson family, with 4 wild sons who helped Frank build a proper barn in exchange for labor on their own place. There were the Chens, immigrants from China who ran a small trading post and kept to themselves but were unfailingly polite. There was old Samuel, a former slave who had homesteaded after the war and now raised the finest horses Frank had ever seen. Slowly, without quite realizing it, they were building not just a home but a community, a network of people who looked out for each other in a place where distance and hardship made such connections essential. The baby came in late February, during a brief warm spell between winter storms. Frank rode for Mrs. Crawford in the pre-dawn darkness, his heart in his throat. She came immediately, bringing her daughter-in-law, Margaret, who happened to be visiting. Frank was banished from the cabin, left to pace outside while sounds he could barely stand to hear came from within. The hours crawled by. He prayed to a God he was not sure he believed in, making bargains and promises. He thought about how quickly everything could change, how fragile happiness was, how much he stood to lose. When the baby's cry finally split the air, Frank nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Crawford emerged a few minutes later, smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is tired but healthy. Give us a few more minutes to get cleaned up, then you can come in." When Frank finally entered the cabin, Beatrice was propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the blanket she had sewn from the fabric they bought in town. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at his son's red, wrinkled face. "He has your stubbornness already," Beatrice said weakly. "Took his time arriving. He is perfect. Do you want to hold him?" Frank had never held a baby before, but he reached out carefully and took his son, cradling him against his chest. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile, yet he squirmed with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Beatrice asked. They had discussed names endlessly but never quite decided. Now, looking at his son, Frank knew. "James," he said. "After your father." Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. He would have liked that. James Frank Garrison. "James Frank Garrison," Frank repeated, testing it out. "Welcome to the world, son." The years that followed blurred together in Frank's memory later, a rush of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. James grew from an infant to a curious toddler to a wild boy who loved the horses and the land with an intensity that matched his father's. Beatrice sang to him constantly, filling their cabin with music, and James learned to sing before he was fully steady on his feet. 2 years after James came Mary, named for Frank's mother, a serious baby who studied the world with grave attention. Then another boy, Thomas, loud and laughing. Then Elizabeth, who was sickly as an infant and terrified them both but grew stronger with time. The ranch grew too. Frank bought more land when it became available, built a larger house to accommodate their expanding family. He bred horses, good stock that sold well to the army and to ranchers. He kept a small herd of cattle, grew hay, maintained the careful balance between ambition and sustainability. Beatrice became known throughout the area for her voice. People would come from miles around when word spread that she was singing, usually at church gatherings or community celebrations. She never charged for her performances anymore, sang purely for the joy of it, but people brought gifts anyway, food or cloth or toys for the children. They faced hardships, of course. A drought one year that nearly broke them. Disease that killed half their chickens and one of their best horses. A winter so cold that Frank had to bring the youngest animals into the house to keep them alive. James broke his arm falling from a tree. Mary developed a fever that lasted a week and left them all terrified until it finally broke. But through all of it, they had each other. On the worst days, when Frank felt the weight of responsibility crushing him, Beatrice would sing, and he would remember why they were doing this. On the nights when Beatrice felt overwhelmed by the endless needs of children and home, Frank would hold her and remind her of everything they had built together. The children grew older. James, at 15, was nearly as tall as Frank and could handle a horse as well as any man. Mary, at 13, had her mother's voice and her father's quiet determination. Thomas, at 11, was all energy and mischief, keeping everyone on their toes. Elizabeth, at 9, had discovered books and would read anything she could get her hands on, often by lamplight when she was supposed to be sleeping. One evening in the summer of 1893, 15 years after Frank first heard Beatrice sing in Central City, the family gathered on the porch after dinner. It had become a tradition this time together, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Tell us how you met," Elizabeth demanded, as she often did. "You have heard that story 100 times," Mary said. "I do not care. I want to hear it again." Frank looked at Beatrice and she smiled, the same smile that had captured him all those years ago. "I was singing in a saloon for Pennies," she began, "and Papa threw down gold." Thomas jumped in, "and asked her to sing forever," James finished. "That is the short version," Frank said. "The real story is longer." "Then tell us the long version," Elizabeth insisted. So they did, trading the tale back and forth, embellishing some details, softening others, painting the picture of two people who found each other against the odds. The children had heard it all before, but they never tired of it, this origin story of their family. When the story finished, James asked, "Do you think we will find love like that, the way you two did?" "I hope you find something even better," Beatrice said. "I hope you find someone who knows you completely and loves you anyway, someone who works beside you and dreams with you." "I hope you are not in a rush," Frank added. "You are only 15. I am just asking." "You will know when you find it," Beatrice said softly, looking at Frank. "Trust me, you will know." Later that night, after the children were in bed, Frank and Beatrice sat together on the porch enjoying the quiet. "Do you ever think about Central City?" she asked. "That saloon, that life. Sometimes. It feels like a dream now, like it happened to different people." "We were different people. Do you miss it, singing for crowds?" She considered the question seriously. "I miss the performing sometimes, the feeling of holding a room's attention, but I would not trade this life for anything. I sing for you now, for our children, for myself. That is enough." "You could still perform, you know. We could arrange it, find venues. Maybe someday when the children are older, but right now I am exactly where I want to be." Frank pulled her closer and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the wind in the trees, the creek's endless murmur. "I love you," he said, "in case I have not mentioned it today. You mentioned it this morning and again at lunch. But I never tire of hearing it. I love you," he repeated. "I loved you the moment I heard you sing, and I love you more with every day that passes. I love you too, Frank Garrison. You saved me, you know. When I was singing for Pennies, I was dying slowly. I had given up on everything except survival. Then you walked in and reminded me that life could be bigger than just getting through another day. You saved me right back. I was just drifting, no purpose, no direction. You gave me something worth building for." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, countless and brilliant in the clear mountain air, holding hands like young lovers despite their years together, and the calluses and scars life had given them both. The children continued to grow, bringing new joys and challenges. James fell in love with a neighbor's daughter, courted her properly, and married her when he was 21. They built a house on the far end of the property and started their own herd. Mary discovered she wanted to be a teacher and went away to normal school in Denver, returning 2 years later with a certificate and a quiet young man named Peter who adored her. They married, and she taught at the small school that had been established in the growing community, while Peter helped Frank with the ranch. Thomas, restless like his father had been, left when he was 18 to see the world. He sent letters from California, Montana, even Alaska, each one full of adventures and promises to return soon. Elizabeth, the reader, surprised them all by developing a talent for business. At 16, she was keeping the ranch's books and advising her father on investments. Frank and Beatrice grew older gracefully, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with age and weather. Frank's hands became gnarled with arthritis, making it harder to work, so he focused on managing rather than doing, letting his sons-in-law and hired men handle the physical labor. Beatrice's voice remained strong, though, defying age, still pure and clear when she sang. They had grandchildren, a whole flock of them eventually. James and his wife Sarah had 5 children in quick succession. Mary and Peter had 3, each one serious and studious like their parents. Even Thomas finally returned home with a wife he had met in Montana, a half-Cheyenne woman named Claire who fit into the family as though she had always been there. And they added 2 more grandchildren to the collection. Elizabeth, to everyone's surprise, never married. She claimed she was too busy, that she had no interest in romance, that she was perfectly content with her life as it was. Frank suspected there was more to the story, but he did not push. Everyone had the right to their own path. The ranch prospered beyond what Frank had imagined that first hard winter in the tent. They had over 1,000 acres now, acquired carefully over the years, prime land that produced good hay and supported substantial herds. The horses Frank bred were known throughout Colorado and beyond for their intelligence and stamina. Money, which had once been so scarce, was now something they had enough of, though neither Frank nor Beatrice ever lost their careful habits, their respect for what they had built. On their 20th anniversary, Frank took Beatrice back to Central City. It was partly nostalgia, partly curiosity. The town had changed, grown larger and more permanent. The mines were mostly played out, but the town had survived by becoming something different, a place where wealthy people from Denver came in summer to escape the heat. The Lucky Dollar Saloon was still there, though under new ownership and catering to a different clientele. Frank and Beatrice walked in one evening, strangers now in a place that had once been familiar. They took a table near the back, and Frank ordered whiskey for himself and wine for Beatrice. A young woman was singing in the corner, her voice pleasant but unremarkable. She sang popular songs from back east, entertaining but forgettable. People talked through her performance, barely paying attention. At her feet was a cup with a few coins. Beatrice watched her with something like sadness in her eyes. "That was me," she said quietly. 20 years ago, that was me. And now, I have everything I never knew I needed." On impulse, Frank stood and walked over to the young singer. He dropped a gold coin into her cup, the same gesture he had made 2 decades earlier. "You have a lovely voice," he told her. "Do not give up on it." The girl looked at the coin in shock, then up at him. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Frank returned to his table to Beatrice, who was smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "Still the romantic cowboy," she said. "Always." They stayed in Central City for 3 days, walking the streets, visiting old haunts, marveling at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. On their last evening, they climbed to a high point overlooking the town, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" Beatrice asked. "After you paid me in gold, I asked you to sing forever. And I have. Not in saloons, not for strangers, but I have never stopped singing. And you never will, I hope. As long as I have breath, I will sing. For you, for our children, for myself. It is who I am." Frank kissed her, there on the mountainside, the same kiss he had given her in the street 20 years ago, full of promise and hope and love that had only deepened with time. They returned home to find minor chaos. One of the horses had gotten into the feed storage and made itself sick. A section of fence had fallen during a storm. Elizabeth had received a letter from a business partner with concerns about an investment. Life, in other words, continued in all its messy reality. But Frank had never been happier. Every problem was manageable because they faced it together. Every challenge was an opportunity because they had built something strong enough to withstand the storms. Thomas and Claire decided to stay permanently, building their own house on the property. With James and his family on one end, Mary and Peter in town but visiting constantly, and now Thomas and Claire settling in, the ranch was becoming a true family compound, multiple generations working together. The 20th century arrived with celebration and speculation about what it might bring. Frank, now in his late 40s, found himself thinking about legacy, about what would remain when he was gone. The land would pass to his children, divided fairly among them. The horses would continue being bred, the traditions maintained. But what else? "I want to build something," he told Beatrice one evening. "Something beyond the ranch." "What did you have in mind?" "A school, maybe. A real one, not just the small community school Mary teaches at. Something that could serve all the families in this area, give children opportunities we never had." "That would be expensive. We have the money. And what good is it if we do not use it for something meaningful?" Beatrice smiled. "Then let us build a school." It took 3 years to make it happen. Frank donated the land and most of the money. Other families contributed what they could. The community rallied together, and slowly, a proper schoolhouse rose from the ground, solid brick with large windows and a bell tower. They hired 2 full-time teachers, Mary being one of them, and opened to 25 students the first year. Frank insisted the school be named for Beatrice, though she protested vigorously. The Ellis School, they called it, and above the door they mounted a plaque that read, "Where every voice matters." On opening day, Beatrice sang for the assembled children and families, her voice carrying across the open land, as powerful and moving as it had been that night in Central City all those years ago. Frank watched her, still amazed that this woman had chosen him, that their improbable love story had become this solid, beautiful reality. The grandchildren grew, some showing interest in the ranch, others pursuing different dreams. Frank and Beatrice encouraged them all, understanding that the greatest gift they could give was not land or money but the freedom to choose their own paths. When Frank turned 55, he began having trouble with his heart. Nothing serious at first, just occasional pains, shortness of breath. But it worsened over time, despite the doctor's treatments. He slowed down, unable to work as he once had, forced to accept limitations. "I am not ready," he told Beatrice one night. "There is still so much I want to do, so much I want to see. Then we will do it together, whatever we can, for as long as we can." They made the most of every day. Frank taught his grandsons everything he knew about horses and land management. He wrote down his experiences, creating a sort of history for the family. He sat on the porch with Beatrice, talking for hours, making sure nothing was left unsaid. Beatrice sang to him constantly, sensing somehow that her voice eased his pain, calmed his fears. She sang the old songs from that first night in Central City and new songs she had learned over the years. She sang hymns and ballads and lullabies. She filled their home with music, with beauty, with love made audible. The years passed, and against the doctor's dire predictions, Frank kept living. His heart remained weak, but he adjusted his life around it, finding new ways to be useful, new sources of joy. He became the family's storyteller, gathering the grandchildren around him to hear about the old days, about cattle drives and frontier towns, about a saloon in Central City where a beautiful woman sang for pennies. On his 60th birthday, the family threw a celebration, everyone coming together, 3 generations filling the house and spilling out onto the land. There was food and music and laughter. The grandchildren put on a play they had written about Frank and Beatrice's meeting, getting most of the details wrong but capturing the spirit of it perfectly. As evening fell, Beatrice stood to sing. The crowd grew quiet, even the smallest children sensing something special was happening. She sang "The Water is Wide," a song about love and devotion, and her voice was as pure and strong as it had been 30 years earlier. Frank watched her, this woman who had been his partner in building a life, in raising children, in weathering every storm. She was older now, her face lined, her hair mostly gray, her hands rough from work. But to him, she was exactly as beautiful as the day he first saw her. When the song ended, he stood and went to her, taking her hands in his. "I asked you once to sing forever," he said, his voice carrying to everyone present. "And you have. Not just with your voice, though God knows that has been a gift, but with your life, with how you love, with how you have made our home a place of music and joy. You have sung forever in every way that matters." "And you," Beatrice replied, tears streaming down her face, "threw down gold when I was worth only pennies. You saw value in me when I had forgotten it myself. You gave me a home, a family, a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. I would sing for you forever, and it still would not be payment enough for what you have given me." They kissed while their children and grandchildren applauded, a moment of pure love witnessed by everyone they held dear. Frank lived 5 more years, defying all expectations. He slowed further, spending most of his time in a chair on the porch, but he remained sharp, engaged, present. He gave advice when asked, told stories when prompted, and simply existed as the patriarch of a large, thriving family. Beatrice stayed by his side through it all, her devotion absolute. She sang to him every day, sometimes for hours, filling his remaining time with beauty. The grandchildren would visit and sit quietly while grandmother sang to grandfather, understanding in their child's way that they were witnessing something profound. On a clear morning in late spring, Frank woke in his bed with Beatrice beside him, as she had been for over 30 years. The sun was streaming through the window, birds were singing outside, and he felt no pain for the first time in months. "It is a beautiful day," he said. "It is," Beatrice agreed, though something in her voice suggested she knew what was coming. "Sing for me. What would you like to hear? The first song you sang for me, in Central City that first night." She sang it, her voice breaking only slightly, and Frank listened with his eyes closed, remembering. A young cowboy with gold in his pocket and an empty space in his heart. A young woman singing for pennies, not knowing that her life was about to change. The improbable moment when their paths crossed and created something neither could have imagined alone. When the song ended, Frank opened his eyes and smiled at her. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. For singing, for loving me, for building this life with me. It has been more than I deserved. It has been exactly what we both deserved," Beatrice said firmly. "A love that lasted, a family that thrived, a life well lived. Stay with me, always. I am not going anywhere." He closed his eyes again, her hand in his, and slipped away peacefully as the morning sun painted the room gold. The funeral was attended by over 100 people, family and friends and neighbors, all come to pay respects to a man who had lived with integrity and love. Beatrice stood by his grave and sang, her voice strong despite her grief, because Frank had loved her voice and she would honor him with it one final time. Life continued as it always does. James took over full management of the ranch. Mary's school continued to grow and serve the community. Thomas and Claire raised their children with stories of their grandfather. Elizabeth managed the family's business affairs with skill and care, and Beatrice sang. She sang at family gatherings and church services and community celebrations. She sang alone on the porch of the house she and Frank had built. She sang to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren as they arrived. She sang because it was who she was, because Frank had asked her to sing forever, and she had promised. She lived 20 more years, long enough to see great-great-grandchildren, long enough to see the ranch prosper beyond anything she and Frank had imagined, long enough to see the school expand and serve hundreds of children. She remained sharp and engaged until near the end, still managing to give advice, tell stories, and above all, sing. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at 84, the family buried her beside Frank on a hillside overlooking the land they had built together. On her headstone, they inscribed words that captured the essence of her life. She sang forever. The ranch continued through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the family story, but never forgetting the foundation. The original cabin Frank built was preserved, maintained carefully, a reminder of humble beginnings. The house they later built became a gathering place for reunions and holidays, filled with children and laughter and music. And in the Ellis School, where children learned reading and writing and arithmetic, there was a portrait of Beatrice Ellis Garrison hanging in the main hall. Every year, on the anniversary of the school's founding, someone would tell the story of how it came to be, which always led to telling the story of how Frank and Beatrice met. The children would listen, wide-eyed, to the tale of a woman who sang for pennies, a cowboy who threw down gold, and a love that built something lasting. Some of them would go on to have their own love stories, their own adventures, their own families. But they would carry with them the lesson that Frank and Beatrice had lived. That love is not just a feeling but a choice, made every day, to build something together that neither could create alone. Years became decades, became a century. The family tree grew vast and complex, branches spreading across the country and beyond. But they always remembered where they came from, that ranch in Colorado, that hillside where Frank and Beatrice lay together under the vast western sky. And on quiet evenings, if you stood on the porch of the old house and listened carefully, some family members swore you could still hear it, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, pure and clear, singing forever.